Oregon's top federal law enforcement official has a busy job, from prosecuting federal cases to leading the Attorney General's marijuana working group. Today, U.S. Attorney Billy J. Williams joins us to talk about pot, political violence, and more. From KGW News, this is Straight Talk.
And welcome to Straight Talk. Thank you so much for being with us. I'm Dan Haggerty, in for Laurel Porter this week. Now, U.S. Attorney Billy Williams has been Oregon's chief federal law enforcement official since 2015. Spent nearly 2 decades in the Department of Justice. He's litigated major cases like the 2016 occupation of the Malheur Wildlife Refuge. And last year, he took a leading role on the Attorney General's marijuana working group. That's a panel of federal prosecutors from states that have legalized cannabis. Welcome to our guest this week, Oregon's U.S. Attorney Billy Williams. Mr. Williams, thank you so much for joining us.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Now, I wanted to mention right off the top, you are the state's only U.S. Attorney. Nationwide, there are 93, so other states have more than one. What challenges do you face being the only U.S. Attorney in this state, and how does Oregon differ from other states when it comes to your responsibilities?
Well, geographically, we're the 9th largest state in the country, so what that means is I spend a lot of time in different parts of the state. We divide the state up into 3 regions. We've got offices in Portland, Eugene, and Medford, and we cover this state basically west to east and north to south. And so that's unique in terms of just the geographic distance. There are a number of other western states, larger states like Oregon, who only have 1 or sometimes 2. So it just means that you know, you're busy. I think it's important to cover all parts of the state and be a good law enforcement partner to both urban and rural communities. So that certainly makes us unique compared to other districts.
Let's talk about the urban community, specifically Portland, and some of the incidents that have been stealing headlines recently. And I'm talking about the Portland protests and the civil unrest that we've seen, the violence. We've seen far left and far right groups clashing that seems to be motivated by confrontation more than the messages that and frankly, we're not really even hearing from these groups at this point. So what goes through your mind when you see images like we're watching right now on screen, when you see the violence unfolding in our downtown?
Well, first and foremost, I think about how difficult it is for law enforcement to manage what is going on, because ultimately they're responsible for the safety of folks who are taking part in demonstrations, as well as citizens who aren't, or observers, and the property that's around the areas where demonstrations are taking place. Portland has been at the forefront of the news on this, in particular the last 2 weeks, but this isn't the first time.
Do you think that these groups are using First Amendment rights as a guise, as a mask, so to speak, to just commit violence and to be aggressive?
Well, members of these groups are, absolutely. The fact of the matter is we all have a First Amendment right to engage in this part of our democracy, and people have always had that tradition in Portland. And so we want to help support those endeavors to take part in those protests. But the fact of the matter is, what it boils down to is we've got 2 essentially warring factions from the extremes of both sides of the political spectrum, who, under the guise of protesting, are simply meeting to engage in criminal conduct, violence towards other individuals in the name of political ideology is nothing more than criminal violence, and that's how we view it, and I think that's how we have to view it from a public safety standpoint.
So we have a quote that you gave to the Oregonian not long ago, and it's similar to kind of what you were touching on just a moment ago, and we can pop it up as I read it. And it says, Portland has a rich history of civic engagement and lawful expression as protected by the First Amendment. The vast majority of Portlanders recognize this and rightfully demand an immediate end to the criminal acts of violence of a violent few whose only goal is to show up and fight with their perceived enemies. These criminals must be held accountable. Now, it's that last sentence that I think trips people up, because how do you do that?
Well, you have to be able to investigate the crimes that occur. And what makes that more difficult, as noted by Chief Outlaw in her comments this week, are individuals who wear masks and otherwise hide their identity. The fundamental part of an investigation is being able to identify who perpetrators of violence are. And so that makes it very challenging because in my view and the view of others, that's why at least some individuals show up to these events with their identities masked in some form or another. They don't want to be detected.
So let's get to that in just a moment. I want to kind of go back through the timeline, at least recently, of the violent clashes that seemed to ramp up immediately after President Trump was elected into office. But most recently, we saw a clash in June, which is just a few weeks ago. But before that, there was another one in September of this year. If you look at video of the two incidents, if you look at video of any of them, it's hard to decipher which one you're looking at.
Right.
You can't really tell, which I think is troubling in its own right, because things haven't changed. They seem to continue going the same way. During the September incident, I was actually interviewing here for a job, and we watched the coverage on television. And on there, I saw people punching each other and hitting each other and macing each other and hitting each other with clubs and sticks. And I remember the next day hearing on the news that no one had been immediately arrested. And to me, I was stunned. My wife and I sat around and thought, wow, it was like something from a movie that we just saw play out, and no one even spent a night in jail. Now, also the next day, the mayor was pretty furious about this as well. And he, at the time, he had an emergency ordinance that he put forward to separate the protesters who were known to be violent into designated areas and allow them to protest, but away from each other. But it didn't go over well. City Council voted that away right away, saying that it infringed on people's First Amendment rights. What was your take on that idea, on separating people and giving them their own space?
Well, I think I understand the thinking behind it. Again, you're trying to, when you're preparing for a potential protest where you've had prior experience with violence, you're trying to determine how best to keep people safe and prepare for that. So the ordinance that was proposed didn't pass. You know, that decision is left to City Hall, but at the same time, this is what a series of protests is what prompted me to convene a meeting before May Day of this year to work with all the law enforcement partners engaged, federal, state, and local, to have a better idea, a better plan, so that we could lessen the chance that violence was going to happen. And we continue to be in the process of meeting again and evaluating this last protest and the events that occurred. But the idea of if there's some way to manage what you believe is going to be nothing more than just criminal violence, I think it makes sense to do that, because again, you're also acting to help protect those folks who are coming to engage in lawful protest and to be safe. It's complicated. There's no perfect answers. You want to be mindful of constitutional rights, First Amendment rights, but also you know, the right to be free from harm by people who are just criminals.
What was the May Day plan? Because if I remember correctly, May Day kind of went off without a hitch. It was great. There was no violence. People were able to demonstrate, and everybody went home safe and sound. What was discussed before that?
Well, we discussed the idea of doing a public service announcement, encouraging people to act lawfully. I participated in that. But also the coordination between our partners who are law enforcement agencies outside of the city of Portland who have agreed to come and assist through mutual aid agreements. And the Federal Protective Service on the federal side has always been a good partner in working through managing these kinds of protests. I do sympathize and agree with Chief Outlaw when she asked this week for more tools. The most recent example is what happened with the protests in Washington, D.C. last week. They utilized big trucks. They utilized cyclone fencing, wrong, there was a way to manage it. And I think we need to have a plan to effectuate that here.
I think if you talk to people, though, here in the city, the first thing they tell you was this is in Washington, D.C.
Yeah.
The people here are different. The protests here are different. Do you think that a show of force like that would incite more violence, or do you think that it would work here?
Potentially, I think it could, but also it's a part of messaging and how it's handled. And I'm not suggesting something so dramatic that it incites a riot over the steps taken. But yeah, I get it. There's at least a perception that Portland is different, but I think that perception is built upon how the city chooses to respond, or whether or not to respond in ways that are accepted in other locations, from New York to San Francisco to LA. So it just depends on what how safe leadership in this city wants its citizens to be. Again, being mindful of people's constitutional rights.
So, talking about response, we mentioned the response after September when the mayor wanted to separate these groups into designated areas. He took criticism for that, and it failed in council. Then we talk about what happened most recently a few weeks ago in June. Again, we see violence. Again, we see people going to the hospital after these protests. And this time the mayor really didn't have much of a plan. Again, he spoke out condemning it and said more needs to be done, but there was no immediate action. Let's play a little clip of what he had to say not long ago. What you're seeing on your screen right now are some of the threats that the mayor has been receiving, because a lot of people blamed him specifically for the protests that we saw. People saying he should be hung from a tree, people saying things that are outlandish and terrifying. And do you have an opinion on some of these? Well,
I do. We just successfully prosecuted a man for making threats towards Mayor Wheeler
on Instagram, correct?
Yes,
yeah.
And he entered a plea just last week, I think. I am adamantly opposed to ignoring threats being made against anyone of that nature. It's just you just can't let that. It's like a cancer that grows if you don't hold people accountable for those kinds of threats, and they go on more than people know. Yeah, more people are making the threats than are being held accountable, unfortunately. And around the same time as we're seeing the protests, we're seeing the threats come into the mayor, we're seeing people prosecuted for threats against the mayor. He is dealing with what to do next. And again, here's what he had to say not long ago.
The way I'm looking at this isn't, which proposals today do I support and which proposals today do I not support. I think everything should be on the table, and we should have a thorough evaluation with our local and our regional and state law enforcement partners. We should have a conversation with the city council. We should include the business community and civil rights advocates and talk about what we're going to do differently to break up this cycle of people coming here to Portland to engage in semi-sanctioned street fights. It's not acceptable. Violence is not acceptable. Okay, so he gave the list of people he wants involved in this conversation. One of the things that makes that tough is that they all have their own ideas on what should be done. One of them coming from, as we touched on not long ago, Chief Daniel Outlaw, who said maybe we should take the masks off these people. You give them a sense of hiding their identity, and they're more likely to commit a crime of violence, of assault, when they think they can get away with it. But if you take the masks off, maybe that will cut down on the violence. What's your take on that? I completely agree with that idea. And look, that if that were to happen, I realize, like so many other things, that they get challenged in a court of law, which is fine. That's where disputes should be addressed, in a court of law and not in the streets of Portland. Is it unconstitutional? I don't believe it's unconstitutional. And in fact, my recollection is there's a prohibition of a similar ilk in New York City. I don't think it's unconstitutional. It doesn't mean that whatever act is taken, that someone may want to challenge it, but okay, that's what courtrooms are for. Well, maybe it's something that City Council will decide before it goes to a courtroom, and we'll see what happens. Something that City Council did decide on not long ago was the decision to leave the JTTF, the Joint Terrorism Task Force. This was something that, again, you said you weren't really
mincing words here, if I have it. You basically, if I remember it correctly, said that it was a mistake that defies logic. There's your entire statement right there. But you more or less said this was a terrible idea. Why was it such a terrible idea? And what have you noticed since the city of Portland has left?
Right. So this is the second time that Portland has left. And the reality is the JTTF assesses threats. In 2018, it looked at roughly 300 threats. Threat evaluations are not based upon anybody's race or religion or ideology. It's based upon actual threats. And the debate at City Hall had more to do with the assertion that it was nothing more than an immigration task force. It's not, never has been, and that is what I meant when I said it defied logic, because it didn't matter what evidence was produced of what the actual JTTF investigations, and there was a good sampling of the kinds of cases that we've done recently, where it had nothing to do with race, ethnicity, or religion. It had to do with threat activity. So, you know, that decision, as I think I mentioned in the quote that you just read from, I understand people have different political ideologies and ideas about things. That's great. That's part of America. But if in the face of that, if you want to ignore facts and the truth, then that's when a decision defies logic.
So that was something that was championed by a newly elected Commissioner, Joanne Hardesty, and she ran on that. It was one of her, her key components of her becoming elected onto the council. There is a fear out there that the federal government is identifying in Oregon people who are living here illegally for deportation, and it comes right as the Trump administration is planning roundups of illegal immigrants across the country. What happens when the Trump administration targets Oregon for somebody in your position who has to straddle that line between working in this state, handling this district, and answering to the people federally?
Well, so the way our office gets involved in immigration matters is when it falls under criminal illegal reentry. So our cases in the immigration field have to do with people who've been convicted of crimes in state court, whether it's Oregon or other states, who've been deported and they return unlawfully and then either commit new crimes or simply identified and picked up by ICE agents. So that's a separate issue than the one that you just addressed, but we pursue individuals who have identified and provable prior criminal convictions and prior illegal reentries. So that's who our office focuses on a larger scale. I completely understand, and go back to your original, the part of your question having to do with Commissioner Hardesty. I understand.
Should people be afraid that there's going to be a roundup? Should people be afraid of a roundup in the state of Oregon?
Well, I think the reality is we'll see how this develops. I don't know of any plan to have roundups here in the state of Oregon. However, I also believe in immigration laws that are on the books, passed by Congress, and I'm not a fan of open borders. I believe in following the law. I believe in the supremacy clause of the U.S. Constitution as it pertains to all laws, and in particular immigration laws. I understand there being fear generated by the, by what we see in news reports and social media. I get it. I understand it. There's a crisis on the southwest border. It's a complicated response to that. But again, to go back to the original premise of Commissioner Hardesty's point on the JTTF, that's not an immigration task force at all.
Thank you, sir. We're going to go to break, and when we come back with U.S. Attorney Billy Williams, we will discuss marijuana in Oregon.